All right. Well, I want to welcome everybody to our impact study briefing on investing in a climate resiliency California, our caregiver resiliency teams. My name is Corinne Eldridge from the Center for Caregiver Advancement. Today's briefing is hosted by the Center for Caregiver Advancement in partnership with the California Workforce Development Board. As we start here, I just want to cover a little bit of housekeeping. Please continue introducing yourself in the chat if you haven't already. As we move through the agenda, we'll have the Q&A function open, so feel free to add questions by clicking on the button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll do our best to answer them at the end of our time together. Use the reaction button next to the Q&A to tell us how you feel about specific points of the agenda. We always welcome that sort of interaction, as it's great to see, as it allows us to gain some insight on this important topic of climate and care. So now we're going to get started. I'm going to pass it over to Ms. Abby Snee from the Labor and Workforce Development Agency. She's the Deputy Secretary of the Future for Work. Abby?
Thank you so much, Corinne, and thank you and CCA for today's event, for sharing the impact of CCA's innovative training for caregivers, and for your broader work building the skills of caregivers in ways that advance their careers and keep the people they care for and their families safe and secure. Thank you also for inviting me here today. Thanks to the vision of Tim Rainey and his colleagues at the California Workforce Development Board, California has invested tens of millions of dollars in high road training partnerships. These are sector-based industry partnerships that advance job quality and equity, center workforce voice, and address climate change. There are well over 40 HRTPs around the state in industries as diverse as hospitality, healthcare, building maintenance, public transit, and electric bus manufacturing. And since the beginning, CCA has been a leader in these partnerships, demonstrating that the quality of care in nursing home and home-based setting relies on skilled, trained, and fairly paid workers. Coming out of the hottest summer in recorded history, we may not need reminders of the profound, pervasive, and frightening impact of climate change. But we may not think of long-term care workers as being on the front line of climate change and emergency response. CCA's training at the intersection of climate and care and its impact on workers, as we'll hear today, reminds us of the critical roles caregivers play in wildfires, extreme heat, and other climate-driven emergencies. The training that CCA provides helps keep our most vulnerable populations safe in these frightening and increasing climate-related events. So thank you for your work and all that CCA does to prepare workers, their families, and the recipients of care and their families. So let me give this back to you, Corinne.
Thank you so much, Abby. And really thank you to the California Workforce Development Board for their belief and investment in the value of long-term caregivers and the role that CCA plays in advancing this work. So my name is Corinne Eldridge, and I lead the Center for Caregiver Advancement. It's really a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And I thank you all for your attendance and interest in the work that we do. For some background on who CCA is as an organization, we were founded in 2000 and have been providing industry-leading training programs for both home care workers and skilled nursing facility workers through both a 501c3 model and a labor management training partnership. We work in partnership with research institutes to build up the body of research on the value of quality trainings for both workers and those receiving care, lending that evidence to advance policy initiatives in conjunction with stakeholders and partners across the state. Our training programs are grounded in evidence-informed curriculum that have been tested and delivered to thousands of workers across California. So for some level setting and foundational knowledge about the workforce, workforce. As I'm sure many are aware, California has quite a substantial long-term care workforce, with over 600,000 IHSS providers providing care for over 700,000 recipients, who by definition would be eligible for the program are seniors and people with disability who meet a low-income threshold. And we have just under 50,000 nursing assistants in nursing facilities across the state. And we see it happening now, that there are shortages in workers, shortages in the workforce, and a predicted extreme shortage across California and across the country in the hundreds of thousands and millions of workers. CCA has been a pioneer in working in conjunction with research institutions to develop impact studies and publish research that shows the measurable impact quality training has on caregivers, those they care for, and the larger healthcare system. We utilize those impact studies to impact policy change for ongoing equitable access to quality multi-week training programs. Now, as we get into this specific project, the Caregiver Resiliency Teams project, we call it CRT. This project came out of what we were seeing and hearing from workers across the state over the last several years around being first responders in times of fires, floods, power outages. And this project really is about preparing, responding, and recovering from these emergencies. We've seen an urgent need for this training program, both from direct feedback from workers and those that they care for, with concerns over the safety of the people they care for, as well as themselves. As Abby talked earlier in her introduction, temperatures have been warming, emergency department visits due to heat-related illnesses are rising in California, and there are also increases in deaths in years with especially high summertime temperatures. And seniors are particularly vulnerable to heat-related illness. Wildfires are projected to become more frequent and severe. Power outages and pollution impacts health. So there's a real need for this training program and for these skills across the workforce. This program was developed in conjunction with a wide range of stakeholders: home care workers, certified nurse assistants, consumer representatives, skilled nursing facility employers, union staff, and you can see all of their voices and perspectives throughout our program, and their perspectives were critical to our collective success. As climate change is a complex topic, we engaged with subject matter experts who, along with our seasoned instructors and curriculum developers, helped us build the training program. You can see their names on the screen here, and we are ever grateful for them lending their expertise to our program. Now, if we get into who we trained in this program, we trained over 500 workers across 13 months. And the training of these workers impacted nearly 3,500 other individuals, being family members and residents in skilled nursing facilities. Our training was targeted to workers who are immigrants and people of color, who, as most of us know, make up the vast majority of the caregiving workforce. And the other layer of eligibility for this program was for workers who live in census tracts who are at the highest pollution burden index on the Cal EnviroScan index, and that coupled with low income and the underinvestment in communities. As you can see by this slide, who we trained, the vast majority of those who we trained are women, and over 63% of the workers are over 40 years of age, which is consistent with what we see across the state with the workforce. Given our program development process, which I'll talk a little bit more in a little bit, we offer this program in 2 languages compared to the 8 that we normally offer. If we get into the details of our curriculum, this curriculum offered both foundational knowledge on climate change as well as hard skills on emergency preparedness and care. We focused on the impact of climate change on vulnerable populations and communities. Spanning 6 weeks, this training covers practical skills such as assembling emergency kits, first aid, CPR, caring and transferring people with mobility needs, communication, sheltering, and evacuation. The training also lays the foundation for fundamental climate change knowledge, climate mitigation and adaptation, and environmental justice. Through the training, we've improved communication, safety, security, well-being, and care, and increased the understanding of the sources and causes of climate change and how it affects the lives of consumers, caregivers, and residents. We go through quite a robust curriculum framework when we're developing a new program. You can see that laid out on the screen here. The next slide lays out what we call our rapid cycle feedback process. And this is quite a robust process where we build the curriculum, we test it, we get feedback from students and consumers and our instructors. We revise the curriculum based on what we hear. We pilot it out again, we revise it again, and then, only then, do we translate it into another language and deliver it. So that way we launch it in the other languages after it has been tested and we receive feedback from folks. So that was really laying out the framework on why we developed this program and how we developed this program. Now I'm going to hand it off to Adrian Dullinger from Vital Research, who's going to go through the impact study methodology and results. Adrian?
Great. Thank you, Corinne. Hi, everybody. My name is Adrian Dullinger, and I'm very excited to be here today to share the results of the CRT program impact study. Next, please. So to assess impact over time, we developed a pre and post survey for caregiver participants in the program. So the pre-survey was administered online prior to the first training class, and the post was completing on their final day of training or in that last week of training. There were in total 5 cohorts of participants. And as Corinne mentioned, there's a rapid cycle feedback loop. So the first cohort served as a pilot where we tested the survey instrument to ensure that it met CCA's needs. And then we also did 2 focus groups, and these were conducted with the participants in that pilot cohort 1 so that we could get feedback from those sessions. The feedback resulted in minor changes to the pre-survey instrument for subsequent cohorts. So the pre and post surveys contained 26 of the same items, which allowed for comparison upon program completion. And these items focused on knowledge of key components in each of the course modules, and really knowing how to access resources or tools needed in case of a climate disaster or emergency. The post surveys also had items that were specific to evaluating the training itself, and there were also assessments of satisfaction and willingness to recommend this program to others. So in addition to collecting caregiver data, we also developed a short telephone survey for consumers of the CRT program participants. So consumers for IHSS workers from cohorts 1 through 3 were contacted, and we asked them about their knowledge or awareness that they had gained from their caregiver completing this course. All data was analyzed using SPSS, and descriptive and inferential statistical tests were run as appropriate. And today I'm just going to be sharing some of the highlights on the impacts of the CRT training program on caregivers and consumers. So let's jump into the data. Next, please. Okay, so overall, you can see here that caregivers overwhelmingly agreed that after taking the CRT training, they were confident that they can keep their consumers safe during an emergency, and that they also learned new caregiving skills. As you can see here, both items had almost 100% agreement. Next, please. And just to ground you a little bit, for the next upcoming graphics, you're going to see the pre-survey data, which is in gray, and the post-training data in orange. So to get an overall sense of knowledge gained, what we did was we looked at the average percent of 13 items that caregivers got, quote, correct on the pre and post surveys. So these were true false items that were specific to topics covered in each of the course modules. And as you can see here, both home care workers and nursing home workers went from getting about half the items correct in the pre-surveys to about 70% correct on the post surveys. So that's a 33% and a 30% increase respectively. And I also want to note here that we did conduct some t-tests to determine if there was a statistically significant difference between the scores of the home care workers versus the nursing home workers. And then what we found was that there was actually not a difference. So this indicates that both groups came in with the same base level of knowledge, and they also gained knowledge similarly. So this really means that both groups are very good candidates for this type of training. Next, please. Okay, so when caregivers were asked about their knowledge on different issues that might arise during a climate disaster or emergency, there were large knowledge gains across the board from pre to post, which you can see here in the slide. So I'm just going to point out a few items here. So after training, 99% of caregivers now know how to safely evacuate their consumers. And 99% also feel confident that they can recognize effects of extreme heat exposure. And again, that gets right back to Abby and Corinne's point about, heat deaths in elderly populations. 98% now know the difference between a carry-on-you kit and a bedside kit, which are very important. And 98% can also recognize signs of physical, emotional, and psychological trauma. Before training, you'll see here that less than half of caregivers knew what to do when there isn't a clean water source, but now 89% of caregivers do. That's very exciting as well. Next, please. One key component of this training was teaching caregivers how to access basic necessities or tools that they might need for their consumers or residents during a climate disaster or emergency. So these are things such as transportation, food, water, medication, shelter. So again, here you'll note that during the pre-surveys, caregivers weren't fully confident in knowing how to access these resources. But after the course, nearly 9 out of 10 caregivers confidently said, yes, they now know how to access these resources during an emergency. You'll also see that although there was an increase from 56% in pre to 85% in post, shelter still remains the resource that caregivers felt least confident in knowing how to access in an emergency situation. Next, please. Finally, we all know how important it is to have specific tools at the ready during a disaster. So again, we're seeing here that caregivers in the CRT program were much more prepared after completing this training. 91% of caregivers now have an evacuation and safety plan, and 90% have an emergency communication plan. So more caregivers have emergency phone apps and complete emergency kits than before the training, with more than 8 out of 10 responding yes to those items. So one area that also increased, but that remains a little bit lower than the others, is having access to power backup supplies, with only 71% reporting that they own or have access to those tools. So we can definitely get an increase in there, I think. Next, please. And finally, we're going to do a quick review of what we found when we spoke directly by telephone with consumers for the IHSS CRT participants. So I think the numbers speak for themselves here, but 100% of consumers that we spoke to felt that their caregiver had the knowledge to help them during an emergency. 97% have confidence in their caregiver during an emergency, and 97% also personally feel more prepared for an emergency due to their caregiver taking this unique training. Next, please. Here we see, since there was not a pre-post, you're only going to see orange here, just to let you know, this is just one survey. So here we see that 3 out of 4 consumers report that their caregiver talked with them about some of these topics covered in the training program. I mean, that's exactly the kind of result we love to see, is going from the caregiver to the consumer. 71% said that there is an emergency kit prepared by their caregiver, and 96% of those respondents said that this emergency kit is specifically for their medical and physical needs. And 76% of consumers that we spoke with also said that their caregiver created and shared an evacuation plan with them. And 77% of those respondents said that they'd actually practiced that plan. Next, please. And finally, 71% of consumers also said that their caregiver created and shared an emergency communication plan with them. And 88% of those respondents have practiced that plan with their caregivers. When it comes to tools, specifically first aid kits, 85% of consumers say they have one in their homes, and they said all of them know where it's located. So 100% know where that first aid kit is. And for those of those who did not have a first aid kit, 67% said that their caregiver has talked with them about how to get one. And finally, about 76% of consumers said they have a fire extinguisher in their home, and 100% of those respondents know where that fire extinguisher is located. And of those who don't have a fire extinguisher, about half of them said their caregiver has talked to them about how to get one. So as you can see from the data shared today, the Caregiver Resiliency Teams project was highly impactful on both caregivers and consumers. Both home care workers and nursing home workers benefited from this program, with 96% saying it was beneficial to them and 99% saying it had a personal impact on them. So thank you for listening, and I'm going to turn it back over to Corinne for the panel discussion.
Thanks so much, Adrian. Really appreciate your expertise in laying out the methodology and results. Now for the panel discussion, I'm excited to be able to introduce our panelists and thank them for joining us today. All of our panelists have impressive resumes and backgrounds, but for the purposes of getting right into the discussion, we're going to keep those introductions brief. So first off, I'd like to introduce Vance Taylor from the Office of Emergency Services. Feedback provided from Vance and Cal OES during the curriculum development process helped mold our CRT courses and allowed us to provide instruction using emergency response best practices. Next, I'd like to introduce Kim McCoy-Wade. As advisor to Governor Gavin Newsom on aging, disability, and Alzheimer's, we will look to Kim to provide context for how climate resiliency trainings for caregivers can help the state meet the goals of the Master Plan for Aging. Our next panelist, Abby Snee, has already been introduced and shared about HRTP and how the Workforce Development Board and CCA partnership resulted in first of its kind training. Next, we have Greg Thompson, Executive Director of the Personal Assistance Services Council, who will share the unique challenges that those with access and functional needs face during climate disasters and why the need for training to address this issue cannot wait. And then lastly, I'd like to welcome Arnulfo de la Cruz, who serves as the president of SEIU Local 2015. Arnulfo will share the impact that the increase in climate emergencies has had on the workforce and the part that training plays in the recruitment and retention of long-term care workers. So thank you all for joining me here today for this important work. First question is going to Arnulfo. So Arnulfo, as you know, long-term care workers have historically been left out of career development initiatives and have struggled to be seen as a professionalized workforce in the state and also across the country. Despite these obstacles, caregivers now face the reality of serving as our first responders to those with access and functional needs during crises. How have you seen this new responsibility impacting the workforce, and what might you say this means for our state in the long term?
Yes, thank you, Corinne. It's a real pleasure to be here. And you know, it wasn't just caregivers that were left out of really basic fundamental protections that most of American workers had, even under the National Labor Relations Act decades ago. It was actually almost half of the workforce of domestic workers, particularly, that were left out of those basic protections. So we see this very much as part of the journey that we're on to bring justice for caregivers and recognize that they are a critical part of the healthcare workforce in California. And the increased climate emergency, what that has done is it's meant a real increased responsibility for direct care workers. The problem is that as their responsibility has increased, there hasn't been recognition that it has. And what I mean by that, no additional pay or benefits and recognition of this increased responsibility. And I remember, Corinne, on a very anecdotal level, when the wildfires were raging in Northern California, most recently, as thousands of caregivers were full of anxiety and preparation for what we were expecting to be a strong hurricane here in Los Angeles County in Southern California, oftentimes they're the ones who know how to get to their consumers the quickest. They know their needs. So again, this is critically important. And I say all of that too within the context that just in the state of California, that we expect the need for a caregiver to more than double in just the next 12 to 14 years. So again, we feel strongly that quality training acts as a key tool in the recruitment and retention of caregivers, which is needed, we know, both to build and attract the needed workforce of the future. So by investing in permanent programs, the state will be better prepared for disaster and also the future needs of those who need care and receive it. Thank you, Corinne.
Thanks so much, Arnulfo. I appreciate all that. I heard a lot of how the access to quality training programs like this would really lend to assist in recruitment, retention, and ongoing skills development. So thank you for that. Our next question is going to Kim McCoy-Wade. Kim, as the state looks to meet its goals through the Master Plan for Aging, has climate change and its particular impact on the long-term care workforce and consumer and resident population been considered? And how would you see a training like the Caregiver Resiliency Teams program playing a part or meeting the needs of our aging and disability population?
Oh, thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you all today. Absolutely. The governor's master plan for aging, which many people on this call were a part of influencing and informing when it came out, had as one of its 5 bold goals, caregiving that works in every sense: paid caregiving, family caregiving, and even the appropriate use of technology in caregiving. And it also recognized, thanks to the input of many of our elder advocates, that we also need to have climate-ready aging. The fires, the rates of living alone are all making climate different, aging different. So both of those were our priorities. And you saw some initiatives with Cal OES. Thank you. Good to see Vance here to bring those things together. And for an example, we now have, as part of a standing emergency response in California, a priority populations task force co-led by Office of Emergency Services and California Health and Human Services that can look at everything from people living at home to people living in assisted living, people living in nursing home, as well as people who are homeless and other populations who may be especially at risk in these situations. So it remains a priority, not just on paper in the plan, but as we always say, in real life, as the rubber hits the road. And I think, looking where we are now, you can really see the governor prioritizing the care economy across all legs of the stool, if you will, whether it's childcare with increased slots and transitional kindergarten, whether it's adult care, increased training and wages for home and community care, for caregivers of people with developmental disabilities, caregivers in nursing home settings. All of that care is more accessible, more affordable, and the care work is being supported. And of course, again, would be remiss if I didn't mention paid family leave for all of us. So I think you see that. And then this summer, I hope you are seeing the climate ready, really needing to make sure climate ready is something all of us do, whether it is schools, families, adults living at home. All of us need to be climate ready for that evacuation. And so to your point, it's not, I think this, Vance, if I'm stealing your thunder, stop me. But, we cannot rely on law enforcement to lead evacuations. We cannot rely on traditional shelters to be where people with more complex care needs are evacuated to. My own 90-year-old grandmother was evacuated to a high school gym in Sonoma back in the Tubbs fire before they could move her to, she wasn't in a nursing home, but that's where she ended up being during the fire's time. So these are complex cases. I know I'm stealing Vance's thunder, so I'm going to stop. But I think all that's to say we are all talking frequently about both the policy and the programs and the practicalities of what it means. And honestly, the people who are already on the front lines of care are also now on the front lines of climate. And how we bridge that gap and how you all have led the way in bridging that gap is just so exciting. And I'm delighted to be here to learn more and to help continue to connect the dots.
Thank you, Kim. Thanks for being here. And thanks for those words and wisdom. It's really great to hear how you keep leading back to the Master Plan on Aging and caregiving networks, and hearing you talk about coordination across departments, as that is, really what we're going to need to take advantage of the ongoing investment in this quality training and quality long-term care. So, she gave a good lead up to you, Vance, and now the next question is for you. So, Vance, caregiver resiliency training is a
Just come and shut the door, okay?
First of its kind training program, using funding streams that we don't typically see used to support the long-term care workforce, despite their responsibility for consumers and residents and keeping them safe in times of disasters. So how do you see the caregiving workforce fitting into our emergency response system? And why is ensuring these caregivers continue to receive proper training so important?
Thanks, Greg. Great question, and thanks. By the way, I think as a general rule, anytime Kim says something, whoever comes in after can just say ditto and call it good. She's the best. In terms of the specific question, yeah, I think, and I'll echo what other people have said, that it's important to recognize that there really is a very real disproportionate impact on people with access and functional needs during every event, during every disaster. And what we're seeing with climate change isn't just that there's an increase in the number of disasters, which I think everybody is seeing and feeling and having to deal with, but it's also that along with this seemingly exponentially larger number of disasters, we've got disasters that the scope and scale and devastation is, unique. It's nothing we've seen before. And so as government, I know that we can do things like stand up a priority population task force. We can do things like work with our community-based organizations, our AFN stakeholders, our tremendous partners to not just identify needs, but to integrate those things throughout the way we plan, prepare, respond, and recover. But even at our very best, government simply cannot reach, assist, or save everyone. And the fact is that oftentimes, whether someone gets the help they need or not, whether somebody lives or not, whether there is an ease or a relief in human suffering or not, comes down to whether or not they have a caregiver who can assist them through that process. Whether they've got somebody who on the worst day or moment of their lives can't be there to provide aid and provide that critical support. But the challenge that we keep running up against is that we cannot just expect that caregivers will instinctively or inherently know how to provide essentially emergency management services. That we have to empower caregivers to aid, assist, and support the individuals that they serve before, during, and after disasters. And to do that, we have to stretch, which is why I love so much this training program. Because what it's doing is it's forcing all of us to stretch, right? To do more, to assist in ways that we hadn't traditionally thought of. And I'll just share it really quick. So a couple of weeks ago, we dropped my daughter off at college. So if I start crying in the middle of this, that's why. So she's going to BYU, which is great. I went there. The one drawback is, of course, the altitude. And my body not being what it was when I was in college, that was a big concern for me. So much so that we thought, well, maybe I'll stay home and my wife will go and drop her off. and get her set up. Well, a couple of days before, my daughter came up and said, "Hey, I've been thinking about it, and I need you to daddy up. I need you there when I go." And I immediately started planning, how can I be there during that moment when she's going to need my support and strength from me. And it came down to being able to rely on a support network, talking them through what the needs were, talking them through what my concerns were, talking them through the best way to assist me as we went through that process. And thankfully, having friends there and former care providers there, was able to work with them so that I made the trip. And when that moment came to say goodbye, and of course my heart split in two, I was able to be there for her the way that a father wants to be there for his daughter. And what's more than that is I realized in that moment that I needed strength and support from her as well. And so I share that because as I look at this training program, it isn't just that we're empowering individuals to provide care at a greater level. It's that individuals are now also able to provide care support to others as well. And so it's dynamic, and I just think it's wonderful, but absolutely necessary in today's risk landscape.
Thank you, Vance. Congratulations to your daughter, and thank you for being vulnerable with us and sharing your personal experience to, I think, give some broader context to the realities as there are increasing incidences and how that affects different individuals. Really appreciate that. Now we're going to move on to Greg Thompson. Greg, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today. You and I have been working together, gosh, I want to say 10, 20 years at this moment in time. So really glad you're able to participate in this panel. So Greg, can you give us and provide a little more context on why a training like the Caregiver Resiliency Teams program are so critical to support those with access and functional needs during a time of climate change emergencies, and what benefits does this provide to consumers?
Thank you, Corinne. It's a pleasure to be here and be part of this esteemed panel. And obviously working with you it's so exciting, and your program is so meaningful because your training is evidence-based. It's cross-sectional, it's provider-centered, and you have outcome measures, and these are all things that are kind of new to IHSS. And so we know when you do a training, we know what works and we don't work. So it's just so exciting that you're doing this. And people with access and functional needs, as everyone's mentioned, are going to be disproportionately affected. And also they're going to be at higher risk than most people. And in an emergency, they'll likely have more severe consequences than most people. Obviously, we've been seeing this in California for years, and I think it's important to sort of, when we're talking about these emergencies, it can be something like the electricity going out, the fires that we suffer all, throughout California, floods, earthquakes. When these things happen, the consumers on the program are usually going to be isolated. It's going to be very difficult for responders to get to them. Roads will be out, phones will be out. And a majority of the people on the IHSS program, half of them probably live with their caregiver, and the 70% are family members. And then the rest are going to be vital to these people. And so I think training them so they can be the first responders, because if people on this program, if they lose electricity, they may not have oxygen. Their ventilators might go out. So they need backup systems for that. If they're not repositioned in their beds, develop pressure sores. So there's so many, I could go on and on about this, but we learned, firsthand in Los Angeles and across California, the consequences during a global pandemic. And I think one thing that I learned is the demand for this training is there. People want it. We were doing teleforms every other week, and we were getting thousands of people on the call asking for information. How do we respond to COVID? What are the protocols? How do we get emergency protective gear? We gave out 1 million pieces a year during the pandemic. So the providers are interested in this type of program, and they're very eager to get this information. And in so many situations, they are the lifeline for the people that they're taking care of. I mean, they rely on their providers. And in Los Angeles alone, we have close to 230,000 people on this program, almost 200,000 providers. And it's so critical as this program increases and providers are moving more toward, we're getting more people that are not family members looking at this as a career. It's important that these people have some kind of training. And I think it's just critical that we as a government or we as a state are supporting these kinds of trainings. And again, I can't stress enough that the way these trainings are set up and tested and measured is just so important. So I'm very glad to be here and glad to be a part of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Greg. Thank you for your partnership and support in this training program. And you said a lot in terms of how the relationship between a caregiver and a consumer in times of emergencies can really have dire consequences if there are negative emergencies that are going on throughout the state, and the caregiver really does make a life and death difference in consumers. And I think, as you have also described, we know that the population of family members available to care for consumers is diminishing. And so the need to attract and retain caregivers in this work through quality training is also a way that we can really think about this program as being advantageous across the population. So thank you for that. Now I'm going to ask Abby a question. Abby, thanks again for joining us here today. It's so great to have you. Since the data for the Caregiver Resiliency Teams program has clearly shown that workforce investments have a profound impact on advancing the skills of these workers, what do you see as the next step to the professionalization of the workforce? And how do we shift policymakers' perspectives on where investments in the caregiving workforce should come from and the need for more?
Yeah, thanks, Corinne. As you and your colleagues say every day, the caregiver workforce is low wage, but not low skilled. And we have to recognize the skill and increasing levels of specialized skill in care that are required by this critical workforce, specialized skills in dementia care, in mental health, substance abuse, and now climate resilience. And I'll just echo some of the other panelists in just kudos to you and your team for the rigor of the curriculum development and ongoing quality improvement that you put into the training program. So one of the many reasons I'm such a big fan of CCA. And the CRT program shows that there's a real demand for training and a desire for workforce development among direct care workers. The training demonstrates the value of investment in caregiver skills and the quality of care for patients and their families, and in greater success for employers and I think this applies to all of CCA's training, in the recruitment and retention of this workforce, which is only the need for this workforce is only going to expand exponentially as the population ages in California and around the country, and indeed the globe. And the results you're talking about today really demonstrate the importance of caregivers in just the core survival of the people for whom they care. The results also prove that these workers are not disadvantaged, but underinvested in, and again, undervalued. And the impact of the CRT program shows that career development and skill building initiatives bring enormous value to the entire community. So we have to bring these points to policymakers, and we have to link training and increases in skill to increases in wages and job quality. And investments in aging, in healthcare, and in workforce should center on the workers whose skill and compassion keep elders alive and safe and support their families. And we have to continue the work that you've started through this project, Corinne, to measure the impact and have those results to demonstrate the impact on both workers and their families. This report should be widely shared. And I know you will do that. It has the potential to bring attention to and change perceptions of the caregiver workforce, and it's crucial and underappreciated and undercompensated role. We have to end the either or almost wedge issue of the trade-offs between good wages and affordable care. And we really have to work on policy solutions that don't trade those off and provide affordable care in a way that, the providers of that care don't have to live in poverty themselves and don't have to rely on public benefits. I would love to see, and think it's something CCA could do, to really illustrate the return on investment in training, and to show the investments we are already making from the public sector in the benefits that we know over half of caregivers have to tap to even survive financially. And would love to see a calculation of what it would look like if those benefits were turned into actual wages.
Thanks, Abby. There's a lot, so much that you said there in terms of, what some investments would be in order to advance this work and advance the policy pieces. And, thank you for being an incredible partner and supporting our work and, elevating the work that we do. As you know, advancing the impact studies to elevate the value of caregivers is, critical to the work that we do. And, I heard a lot from what you were saying around job quality, worker-centered, in conjunction with, how we do is keeping the consumer-directed model of care always in mind as we build our home care curriculums. And perceptions, that's, I think, one of the biggest issues that we've always been up against is the perceptions of home care workers and nursing home workers, in that these are skilled jobs. This is important work. And there's ageism, there's sexism, there's racism. It's not just one thing that has contributed to where we are with both nursing home workers and home care workers today. So thank you for all that, Abby. So now I'm going to ask all of our presenters to put your cameras on, and we're going to ask one question to the group, and then we will certainly have time for questions from the audience at the end here. So I'll start off with a question to all of our panelists, and that is, the results of our Caregiver Resiliency Teams program show the benefits of climate resiliency training for long-term care workers, those they care for, and the communities as a whole. And so while the intersectional nature of the CRT trainings bring together those invested in climate change, long-term care, emergency response, and workforce development. It also creates a unique challenge. And so with a program like Caregiver Resiliency Teams that reaches across department purviews, how do we push forward the collaboration and commitments that are required to fund and administer permanent access to quality trainings? And what might you see as the next steps toward achieving this and ensuring climate resiliency trainings is not seen as a hot potato issue that is really passed across departments until there is another disaster? So feel free to come off mute. Vance, are you off mute purposefully? Did you want to start?
I can start if you want me to. I'm happy to chime in after other people express their thoughts too.
I see three. Go ahead, go for it, Vance.
That's fine. No, I was just going to say, when I think about the issue, to me, we're really at a point where this is just life safety, right? So this is not a nice to have, right? This becomes just a necessity. I think the sooner we start to look at it through that lens, the less this becomes about competing financial priorities and more simply just a part of the emergency management system and process. One of the nice things that happens, and this, of course, California, right? The good and bad. It's bad, but we have so many disasters. But one of the good things that comes from that, of course, is the coordination, collaboration, and partnership. So as I look across the family of state agencies, there are more and more state agencies that play an active role in emergency management, that recognize that in order to ensure all Californians can be safe, secure, and independent, that we have to invest in strategies, approaches, and training to make that happen, right? That it won't take place on its own. So that I think it absolutely warrants a discussion about how do we make sure that we can collaboratively work to support funding for this type of program, which we're seeing is proven to be effective. So it's no longer, like I said, something that we should do or would be nice to do. I think we're at that point where we have to do it.
Thanks, Vance.
I'm happy to jump in, Corinne. One thing I've certainly learned at the state is just how siloed things are and these functions are, but this training and this work really sits at the intersection of emergency services, climate mitigation, and resilience and workforce. And listening to everyone today, just a couple of ideas, if we're going to do a little brainstorming here, is how might we build this training into the required curriculum that is required for licensing of CNAs. That could be something that CDPH could work on, into the requirements for home care certification, into the so that it gets into the training and becomes part of ongoing training that is required for incumbent workers. I think there could be some room to push there. And I'll throw an idea to you, Vance, since I've had some involvement with the Priority Populations Task Force, which you've just chaired so beautifully and meaningfully. I mean, that tends to come together when there's emergencies. Do you think there might be an opportunity for that task force to really consider this issue as something in a non-emergency way? Right.
Yeah, it's interesting because we typically work on either the response or the recovery side. It would be wonderful, and this is sort of the plan, I think, as we look to evolve, to work on the preparedness side.
Yep.
right? I think this aligns perfectly with,
Right.
with what you're saying there.
Happy to be part of that.
Yeah, that'd be great. Great discussion. Thank you, Abby.
Arnulfo or Greg, would either one of you like to respond to this question?
Sure. Thanks, Corinne. Yeah, look, I think this webinar is a demonstration of a piece of the work that you do to really build consensus, but it's the organizing, right? Organizing stakeholders, getting the public's buy-in as to the impact and the importance of this. And then I would also argue too, I know that we've been talking about this within the context of climate emergency. How about all the other emergencies that happen in our lives, in our community, right? I think I would argue that the benefit of this training can be used outside of what the context that we're using it in, and the challenges that both recipients of care and caregivers are faced with every single day. So there's a lot of these skill sets that are applicable outside of the context of a climate emergency. But I do think, and at some point as good organizers, we do have to get with the decision makers and talk about the resources that are needed, but we do have to organize and really keep doing what we're doing, building consensus, lifting up the impact and the importance of it, and making sure that we're connecting that directly with decision makers so that we can make progress. Thank you.
I have a couple thoughts, Corinne, on the training aspect of it. And when we talk about permanent training or including this in the curriculum, when you look at IHSS, there really is no training. To be an IHSS worker, you're not getting trained. And in the beginning, this program is 50 years old. And when it was the majority of family taking care of family, that was great. But as it expands, we are seeing a population of people that have to rely on IHSS workers they might get from a registry. And oftentimes these workers have not been prepared for this situation they're going to go into, whether it's helping somebody that's been experiencing homelessness or somebody that has a significant new mobility or other kind of disability, go home from a hospital. They're not prepared. And I don't think it's fair for the workforce, as we're talking about all the tremendous things they do. They should receive the same kind of training as somebody else when we compare them to a CNN in a nursing home or even somebody working at McDonald's. Those people are prepared, they get training, and our workers are not. And I think that has to do obviously with, we're sort of caught between protecting this, the consumer directed piece, which is very, very important for the people that have the ability to make the choice and have the ability to manage their home care worker. But what we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, there are 15, 16,000 people in the state that can't find providers. They can't navigate the system. So I think we need to take a look at the system as a whole and then incorporate more trainings like yours.
Thanks, Greg. And thank you to Arnulfo for what you shared. I think there's a lot of echoing in terms of the answer to this question, to take what we've learned through this program, as well as the previous work that CCA has done to continue to advocate for continued investment in quality training programs. And, we know we have some of that for home care workers as it relates to the Career Pathways program. And, we'll continue to work in collaboration for some advocacy around that work and expansion in a variety of ways. And I really appreciate everyone's thoughts as it relates to how this training program and the collaboration across departments is really a necessity, right? Like, it keeps coming back to the reality that care workers, home care workers, skilled nursing facility workers keep people safe, right? Real lives are at stake here. And, quality training does make a fundamental difference in not just the lives of the consumers and residents, but in those who do the work too. It keeps them there, right? Like if you have access to quality training programs, then you see yourself differently, and you know that the work that you are doing is the right thing to do. We hear from workers all the time of, I've been a caregiver for 20 years, and gosh, if I had this training program 20 years ago, things would have been a lot different. And so it's, we have a lot of work to do, and there's been a lot of great work that we can build on to advance this. So I'm going to ask our team in the background here. I think we have some other questions from the audience that are queued up. Let's see here. Maybe we don't. So folks, if you're in our audience and you have a question you want to ask to the panel, please put it in the Q&A box. I don't know if I've ever been part of a panel where there aren't any questions from the audience.
Corinne, I could get us going.
Please.
I see Gary Lee earlier, I think it was at 12:21, put a question in the chat. Can we check with some migrants recently got their work permit and train them? Just without getting into all the complexities of our kind of broken immigration system, I think it's a really good question, right? This work historically has been done by Black and brown women. The connection between the future workforce and immigrants in California, even within our own union, a little bit under half of our caregivers are born in another country. So I really think it's a good question, and we do have to be thoughtful. How are we ensuring that the work of caregiving is not poverty work without recognition, given that it's primarily done by Black and brown women and many of them immigrants? So I just think I think Abby said it, the intersectionality in this case, the intersectionality between migration and immigrants and caregiving. It's odd that maybe some folks at the federal level who had blocked a historic investment of care, for example, on Build Back Better, it's those same folks who one day are going to need a caregiver. And it wouldn't surprise me maybe that caregiver is going to be an immigrant. So I just think it's an important conversation. That doesn't even include right now what's happening to the issue of TPS, right? The TPS for Central Americans, for other folks. So there's a lot of issues around immigration, and I think the future care workforce that are really important. It's an important incorporation into this conversation. So thank you, Gary, for that question.
Thanks, Arnulfo. I see one question in the chat that I will answer. So the question is from Linda Holt, and the question is, hi, will there be an opportunity for a currently employed caregiver to receive this training that was given as part of the study? And if so, how do we sign up? Thanks, Linda. So we are offering this training program through the Career Pathways program. And it's offered a little bit differently because what you've seen throughout this presentation and this discussion is that it was a 6-week, multi-week program. And so you can enroll in it through the Career Pathways program and know that you would have to sign up 6 times. So that way for each 6 weeks of the classes. And then if you are a San Bernardino County caregiver, we're very excited. You saw Abby's smile there, that the California Workforce Development Board has made another investment in caregiver training, and we will be launching this training program in San Bernardino in its original format of 6 weeks. And we have seats for about, I think, 500 workers for the totality of the program in San Bernardino. And again, that is starting in January of next year. And we'll have an impact study done by our friends at UCSF. And I saw Jarman Ye somewhere in the audience. And so Jarman and her team, we're excited to be partnering with them on the impact study for that program. And then I see another question here from Luis Lopez, saying that he's an IHSS provider and he joined the backup program. Awesome. That's great to hear, Luis. His experience serving clients with different levels are of care and needs, and it's crucial for providers to receive training in all levels of care as each recipient varies. Thanks, Louise, for that comment. We look forward to seeing you in some of our training programs, and you can send us an email if you don't know how to sign up for them. But we would be happy to have you and see your face in the training programs that we do offer. All right. Any of our panelists have any other comments that you might want to share with our audience?
Just related to the last question, if providers live in Los Angeles and they're interested in becoming a backup provider in LA, we do offer training, and we have a $3 differential as opposed to the $2 differential. So if that gentleman is in Los Angeles, he could reach out to us on our website.
That's great, Greg. Thanks for sharing that. And we've had this conversation over time in our NOFO as well, and that is, well, if the backup providers can get a significant wage increase, and they're recognized for the training that they have, it's really building foundation for training and how that can impact wages for others. So thanks for mentioning how it differs in Los Angeles if you're a member of the backup provider system. There's another question here. Will the training develop over time to include more emergencies that may be region specific? Are there any ideas to some restructuring of the curriculum to go more in depth on certain topics, such as post-emergency recovery and the inclusion of psychological first aid? Great question. So the training itself, what we've reported on was the pilot period. Where we are in the training, moving it across the state, we have, I want to say, I don't know the number of slots off the top of my head. And, when we can get geographically specific when we move to San Bernardino. So Vance has offered the services of the OES folks in San Bernardino, and so we'll have that specific information when we roll out in January. So we're excited about that. And then, in the restructuring of the curriculum, we're always restructuring. Our instructors have in-depth knowledge and experience, and really listen to what our students say. And then we go through a feedback cycle. So that way, then, once it's been tested, then we take all of the feedback from our instructors and that we've seen in our pre-post quizzes and our surveys. And we usually do, with a 3-year cycle, but with our newer curriculum like this is, we're mindful that, things change and it can be evolving. All right, another question, how do providers who want more trainings like this push for more? Love that. Advocacy, your voice, make a huge difference, right? In order to get ongoing funding for these programs, your voice as a caregiver, the voice of the consumer you care for are really critical. I know that your union, do an incredible amount of advocacy work. And so it seems like you're a provider. If you wanted to connect with the union, Arnulfo, you should tell me if I'm off base here, but they're always looking for more leaders to have their voices be heard. And then here's another question. What languages was this provided in? Do you offer training in more languages? This particular program was offered in English and Spanish. And the reason it was offered in those two languages was because it was a pilot program and we have this rapid cycle feedback process. So we wanted to ensure that we had included the feedback from students in the class as well as consumers. And so then we translated it to Spanish and delivered the program in Spanish. We normally train in 8 different languages, so Spanish, English, Armenian, Cantonese, Mandarin, Korean, and recently through the Career Pathways program, we also included Russian and Vietnamese. And we know, in other parts of the state, there are other languages that if we, get enough folks interested in those languages like Hmong, we'd love to be able to expand to those other languages as well. All right, well, I think our questions are finished, and really want to thank everybody for coming to learn about our training program and really appreciate your interest. I want to give a big shout out to our panelists. Thank you for taking your time out of your day and sharing your expertise. And you see on the screen that you can download the full report. So there is a physical document that has a lot more details than what we were able to share through this webinar. And if you have any additional questions, you can contact one of our staff. And I would also just like to say thank you to our staff who's worked a lot behind the scenes to make this webinar successful. So thank you everybody for your interest. We look forward to hearing from you. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Corinne.